Stephen again, and today we're going to take a look at some of the materials that I've been using for self-study ground school. Now, I cannot guarantee that these are the right set of materials for you because I can't even guarantee they're the right set of materials for me. What I can say is that this is what I have found so far in my research into what it takes to do flight training later. And like I said in my last video, this is an experiment. I'm just preparing as much as possible now for later flight training. So we're going to go through today some of the things that I have found to be useful in that so far. So in order to keep things real, I'm going to point out two things. The first is there's no hair left under this hat. I'm not fooling anybody. The second is that right there. I'm going to put that on the screen whenever it's appropriate to point out how much flight training time I've had and what my current rating is. So as you can see right now, goose egg. Let's get started. So that said, this is not a ground school and not a substitute for a ground school by any means. I'm not teaching any concepts here. I'm just showing the materials that I'm learning the concepts from as well. And so if anyone has anything that they'd like to recommend, please put it into the comments. I'm sure some of you may be on the same journey that I am, and we can have a discussion and a conversation in the comments. I'd love to hear where you are in your journey and what you found to be useful as well. And I'm sure anyone else who is watching this video would be interested in that. To begin with, we have two tools that you're allowed to bring with you into the FAA knowledge test. We have a sectional plotter. There are several different kinds of plotters. This one here is one from Sporty's. It's made out of plastic, and you use a plotter to measure distances and angles on a sectional chart. Warning, the actual charts that you have for reference on the FAA knowledge test are not to the same scale, so you can't actually use the distance measuring, but the angle measuring capabilities of this are actually useful on the FAA knowledge test. Additionally, you're allowed to bring in either a standard calculator or a flight calculator, or both. The flight calculator is also called an E6B. This one here is also from Sporty's. There are several other models available. I know ASA has one as well. There are manual flight computers that look more like an old slide rule, but I've never used a slide rule in my life. I grew up in the calculator age. This is very familiar to me. It's similar in some ways to the graphing calculator that I used when I was in school, except the special functions on this device are aviation functions rather than graphing functions, and you are allowed to use this on the FAA test. It does things like compute which runway you should use based on wind angle and help you with weight and balance problems and so on. Speaking of E6Bs, there are E6B apps that you can get on iPhone and I assume on Android as well. I have an iPhone here. I have installed one and played with it a little bit, but I can't say very much about it. I haven't really learned to use it well because for me right now, since I'm studying for the FAA knowledge test, what I need to learn to use is the flight computer that I can actually use on the FAA knowledge test. And that's going to be one of these manual ones that has a memory that can be wiped at the beginning of the test. So app-based E6Bs are something that just aren't going to be useful to me until later, frankly. And my intent is actually to keep this, now that I have it. I could resell it, but really I'd rather just keep one in my flight bag. You never know when you're going to need something in an emergency situation. So who knows, a few years from now I may decide that that's just simply useless weight, but my intent right now is to just keep this. I have to have it for the test anyway. So next we're going to take a look at a few books that I have physical copies of. Shortly we'll take a look at some books that I just keep as PDFs and other references that I keep on an iPad. But there are a few books that I have physical copies of, either because there is no PDF available or just for convenience. The first one, this is not what you want to start out your flight training with, but I have a physical copy of the 2017 FAR-AIM. The FAR-AIM is the Federal Aviation Regulations, which is the actual rules of the FAA, and the Aeronautical Information Manual, which is commentary on the rules and other information that you need in order to interpret the rules and apply them, and recommendations, things like that. This is available for free for download from the FAA's website. However, at least during this first year, during my training here, I felt like I wanted a physical copy of the rules for reference. this is likely, it's a fairly heavy book. I don't picture myself buying the 2018, the 2020, the 2025 copy of this every single year. Like anybody else, I'm sure I'll just keep up with the changes along the way. And if I do keep a copy of it, I'll just keep it as a PDF in the future on an iPad. And the reason that I bought this was because copies of this are actually fairly cheap. I think $10 or $15 plus shipping, but if you're buying something else, then you can just get it included in with whatever else you're buying so that the shipping charges are amortized. And so I bought it because it was relatively cheap. I thought it would be useful to have a physical copy during my initial training. Next, we have the Student Pilot's Flight Manual. This is another ASA publication, and this covers ground school topics. I have been reading this in parallel with the video ground school that I have been taking as well, that we'll talk about shortly. Next, we have a couple of books by Jason Schappert, Aviation Acronyms. I'll tell you the truth, when I bought this book, I thought it was going to be an explanation of a lot of the acronyms that you hear in writing about aviation, but actually what it is a list of the many mnemonic devices that pilots use in order to remember various things, like the ANDS acronym, accelerate north, decelerate south for compass errors, whenever in the magnetic compass, whenever you're making a turn. And that's useful, actually. The book isn't what I thought it was, but it actually may be a little more useful than what I was buying it to be. And then we have the FAR AIM in plain English, which is a summary of a lot of the information that's in this great big old book here. You're not going to learn a lot from this book. It's not, I don't think that's its intent. It is summaries of the most important rules. And what I have done actually is I went through one afternoon and just looked at the summaries of each of the FAR sections, and if I felt like I had a really good grasp on it, I went ahead and marked it with a green for review occasionally, and the things that I felt like I still needed to spend some more time getting into my memory or getting into my understanding, I marked with a red or a yellow. So I have this book quite marked up, actually. Light gun signals, fairly simple, just a memorization task. A little more work for me to do on that to make sure that I don't get them mixed up. Then we have Stick and Rudder by Wolfgang Langewiesche. I'm probably mispronouncing that last name. This one is a little bit different than the other books we just looked at. This was originally published in 1945, and its age shows. It's many decades old now. But it came highly recommended, and so I picked up a copy anyway, just to read through it. And I'll say this, I do feel like I understand, without having actually flown myself yet. Remember the point that I'm at in my journey right now, that I feel like I have a little bit of better understanding of the way, at least, that planes fly in the simulator now. We'll see whether or not this helps me any when I actually start flight training. However, I came away from this book absolutely convinced that airplanes should not have rudder pedals anymore. That was this gentleman's opinion, and in fact, he was convinced that by 1955, no airplane would. Obviously, that did not happen. And I understand. I read this a few months ago, and as I've continued studying, I think I understand a little bit better why that never happened. But it's an interesting read. It makes you think. Next, we have charts. I've got some paper charts here. If you follow very much what people who actually fly are doing now, a lot of people will get charts online or in an app like ForeFlight on an iPad, and I'm sure I will be there at some point. Additionally, if you follow flight simulation very much, they all talk about the charts that are available for free on web pages now, which are essentially copies of what the FAA publishes in these paper publications. And those are all fine for their purposes. And in fact, in particular, I don't imagine that I'm going to carry paper charts with me forever, because that's just not the world that I'll be living in 10 years from now. But for learning right now, here's what I can do with a paper chart that I can't do with a web page. Open it up, fold it out, cover the entire table with it, and plot a course with no scrolling and no dragging. In fact, you can see a little course that I plotted right here outlined for a flight in the simulator one time. These are fairly cheap. I think they were about $6 a piece. And for me, they're a one-time purchase because since I'm not actually flying with them, I don't have to keep them up to date. These are from the summer of 2016, and actually some of them have not expired yet, some of them have expired, and it just absolutely does not matter for flying in the flight simulator or for working sample problems on ground school. They're not an ongoing expense. I felt like having a few of them would be a useful thing, and it has been so far. So I got a few sectionals for regions that are near where I live, and a couple of terminal area charts as well. Those are the TAC type charts. And what the terminal area charts cover is an area around a large metropolitan area. So here we have an Atlanta TAC, and the little blue box there is the area that this covers. And that's just right around Atlanta and the busy Atlanta airports there. And then in addition to these charts, which show airports and VFR airways and other information that you need in order to fly, you need to know something about the airports that you would be landing at as well, and that's where these chart supplements come in. This is what used to be called the Facilities Directory. They have just recently changed the name to Chart Supplement. This here is the chart supplement for the Southeast US. And actually this is the one that I meant to order. Again, this is relatively cheap. If I were going to be flying with this, I would have to keep it updated, but for use in training and in use in a simulator, I can just order this one copy, and then in the future when I'm actually flying, get my information from valid sources online. And I don't mean from the random fly-by-night website that republishes all of this. I mean the valid places where you can get this information officially updated. But for simulator and for flight training, one-time purchase to have something that I can pick up and look through and get comfortable and familiar with. That's just the way that I wanted to do things. And in fact, I ordered the Southeast, and the company that I ordered it from accidentally sent me South Central. And I checked my receipt. I had ordered the right one. They just sent me the wrong one. But I called them up. They made it right. They just sent me the correct one. They didn't require me to send the other one back. So I was impressed by that, and now I have a copy of both. The chart supplement is like the phone book for airports. So just like with the phone book, I don't expect to have a paper copy of this for very long, but just like with the phone book, you go in alphabetical order and look up what you want to find. I'm just going to pick one at random here. So here's an airport in Miami, Florida, the Dave Collier Training and Transition. There'll be a map of the airport and information about what you need to know about when the airport is in operation, if there's a tower, when the tower is in operation, how to operate the airport lights, whether there's fuel available, and all kinds of other information that you need to know in order to pick where to land during your trip. Here's one thing that is incredibly important, and that is a water bottle. The most interesting man in the world says to stay thirsty. That is absolutely the wrong advice. Stay hydrated, my friend. Additionally, I have PDFs on my iPad. These are PDFs that I've dropped into the iBooks app on my iPad. I've got copies of the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, the Weight and Balance Handbook, the FAR and the AIM. So in addition to this paper copy, I have PDF copies that I can keep updated on the iPad going forward. The four things that I just mentioned, those are free downloads from the FAA or other government websites. You can also buy paper copies of them, but when it comes to reading a book, I would really just as soon read it on my iPad and just have all of these books available wherever I go. Some of these books over here, the reason that I have a hardback copy is because, or a paper copy is because that's what was available. For me, a book is not like a chart. The chart I can lay out, I can work with it, I can take up a big area with it. I would just as soon read a book on the iPad, and so the books that I can keep on my iPad, I actually do. And right now, that's the free publications from the FAA. On my iPad and my iPhone, I have the Sporty's Learn to Fly course. So this is essentially my ground school. This is the video lessons that I've been taking. There are courses from Sporty's and from King's at the very least. I know of those. I'm sure there are others. I've been very happy so far with the Sporty's course. Let's see what happens whenever I actually get into flight training. But what I have done is use the Sporty's course in conjunction with a written book to back each other up. There's a prevalent theory about learning that there is such a thing as different learning types. So the theory is that some people are visual learners and would learn better from having something demonstrated visually. For instance, that would correspond to the video training in the Sporty's app here. That some people are auditory learners and that they learn better by hearing things. That some people learn better in reading in a book. My understanding is that the research does not back that up, that that's an old theory that is no longer true, and that what really matters is catching somebody on a day that he has no other distractions, for children, that they are well fed, that they've had their breakfast, that there's not something else that is preventing them from being able to put their brains to the task of learning. Then also using a presentation of the material that is appropriate for the kind of material. Whenever you are learning math and you're charting graphs, there is the visual aspect of the graphs, and then there is the written aspect, the written form of the problems, and those are different ways of presenting the same material, and they both have their strengths, and it's not necessarily that one person will learn better in one way than the other, that the research is really that different aspects of the material should be presented in different ways. I bring all that up because in the meta-studying I've done, the studying about flight training that I've done, I've seen that theory brought up a couple of times as a reason that you would pick reading a book, watching videos, or working hand-on-hand with I don't have one I can point to here, but working one-on-one with an actual flight instructor in a classroom environment. The approach that I'm taking is that eventually I will be working with a flight instructor, and hopefully I will have prepared well enough that we don't have to spend a lot of time in a classroom environment. There will be some, and I will absolutely do essentially whatever my instructor thinks is best, because he's been doing this a long time. But in trying to prepare ahead of time, I am both watching the videos, flying the flight simulator, trying to learn the lessons from that, but also reading about what a flight simulator does not do well, so that I can try to avoid learning bad habits as much as possible there, and also reading. Regarding the theory of different learning types, I know that they were still teaching that to education majors in at least some colleges a decade ago, because my wife was an education major. She is now a teacher, and they learned that theory. And for purposes of flight training, I look at it this way. You either want to learn the material or you don't. If you don't, there's not much that anybody can do to help you learn it. If you do, why would you not avail yourself of as many different kinds of ways of presenting the material and as many different aspects of the material as you can? So in addition to reading, in addition to watching the flight training videos, I've also been listening to aviation podcasts, which are not particularly about flight training, but they're just about flight in general. I have been immersing myself in it actually for the last few months because it is continued exposure over time that, for me at least, really bridges that gap from knowing something about it and having a better understanding of it. And so, again, I haven't started the flight training phase of this project yet, and I'm sure there is a lot for me to learn, and I'm going to go into it with an open mind. But with the goal of preparing myself as well as possible before that starts, I've just I want to make available to myself anything that I can that's within my reach, and an online flight school, books, podcasts, some reference materials. These are things that really, I think, can help me get a grasp on, so that whenever I'm actually with an instructor and paying for an instructor's time later, I am as well prepared as I possibly can be. And that's the goal behind all of this preparation. Next, we're going to look at some luxuries. These are things that I would not have bought if I had done this 10 years ago, being a little bit more financially secure learning to fly at the age that I am has allowed me to get a few things either in preparation for the future or just because I felt like it would enhance my simulation flying in the meantime, that are not necessary in order to learn to fly. So don't feel like you have to have any of this. So first is my flight bag. What do I need a flight bag for? I'm not actually flying yet. And to some extent, this was part of telling myself I am going to learn to fly. I am going to follow through on this. If I'm going to learn to fly, I'm going to need a flight bag. You absolutely don't need one to get started. Also, it does serve a practical purpose, because it's a place for me to put all of the rest of this stuff. In the meantime, to keep it from just floating around the house, disappearing, one of the kids taking it off somewhere, or what have you. We have a knee board. This really had more to do with the simulator than anything else. I mean, it's a knee board that I would use eventually in flight, but the reason that I have one now is so that in using the simulator, I'll have charts, E6B, and so available on my knee in a confined configuration, more like in a real airplane, than if I had all of that stuff sitting at a nice table that I could just pause the simulation, stand up, walk over to the table, and look at it all. This is not about flight training. This is about simulation and probably going a little overboard. I also went ahead and got a pilot's flashlight because I found a good price on one, and so I could include it with the shipping cost of other things that I was ordering. This is a Smith & Wesson flashlight, and what I liked about it is that you don't have to cycle through the white light to get to the red light. So you would use a red light in the cockpit at night to avoid destroying your night vision, your night adapted vision in the cockpit, and that's not very useful to have a red light on your flashlight if in order to get to it you have to cycle through the light first and harm your night vision after all. So this has two separate buttons, one for red and one for white. That seemed like a good idea. And here is my biggest splurge. This is a Sporty's SP400 radio. You do not need this for flight training. You do not need this really for anything that I'm going to do that has to do with training. What I got this for was for two things. One, liveatc.net doesn't cover any of the airports that are close to me. And so, I like to listen in on the air traffic control and get familiar with the way that they talk. I've been doing that a little bit. And so I got this partially so that I could listen to the local CTAF. I occasionally hear planes calling their turns coming into the airport that's closest to me. And the CTAF also covers the Coleman Airport, which is not very far from me. And it's actually kind of interesting to listen to this on a Saturday morning because they do parachute jumping there. And so there'll be calls on the CTAF all morning long about the parachutes away and don't overfly the airport for the next 10 minutes. And then he'll call again when they're down. And so that's interesting to listen to. But this was, again, this is a luxury item. This was a splurge. I would not have bought it if my point was just the simulator. I felt like it was something just would be interesting for me to have and to use in the short term, and would be a good backup in the cockpit eventually. Now, eventually I will be flying, and when I'm flying, having a radio in my bag, and just in case the radio in the console goes out, may be very important someday. So for now, this is for fun. In the future, this is going to be very serious. And the second reason that I got this, and it really didn't take multiple reasons to convince me, I wanted to get one, but I had to convince myself to spend the money on it. It has to do with drone flight. I've been working on my remote pilot certification, and with that, if you're flying anywhere near an airport, in addition to getting clearance to fly there, it is recommended, though not required, that you listen to the local tower or CTAF. And so, in addition to just wanting to listen into the local CTAF, just because I'm interested in aviation, I also potentially could use this to, if I'm flying in the general vicinity of an airport, within 5 miles of an airport, to listen for planes that may be coming in the general direction of where my drone is, so that I can get out of the sky in case they're coming in low for a landing. Manned aircraft aren't supposed to go lower than 500 feet unless they are landing or taking off, and drones aren't supposed to go higher than 400 feet, so you have a buffer there if everybody does what they're supposed to do. But still, good to listen to a pilot call his turns and get out of the air if it sounds like they're anywhere near you. And finally, I just wanted to show this. It's kind of neat. Because I ordered some other things from Sporty's one day, they sent a picture for free, just for shipping costs, of a Cessna, a typical training aircraft. And that's kind of neat to have. I don't really need this. I've got this in my simulator. I've been using that to learn. But no, hey, they sent a poster for free. Great. So it could be useful if you don't have a simulator and you're just reading in books. Well, here's what the configuration looks like in an actual airplane. But there's lots of other places to find that information as well. Still, it's kind of neat. And that brings us to one more item, which is the flight log. I have here a new empty flight log. No annotations in it yet. Whenever you start flight training, your CFI will make annotations in this log about your progress in flight training and how much time you've spent in flight training and how many hours in the air, and then you record your own flights as well. And this becomes a log of your flight experience. So I'm starting from 0 here, and we're going to fill this up. So that's it today, guys. Thanks. If you are interested in following along, then click that subscribe button. Or if you're just interested in watching me make a fool out of myself, you can also click that subscribe button. Thanks again.